This is the Spiritual Download. Today we'll have a fruitful conversation with Tom Doss. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Kyle. Hello.
Hello. The first question I want to ask, and it'll be kind of the main question that we'll think about, is who we are, our essence. So if I ask Tom, if I ask you who you are, how would you respond to that, thinking that we have kind of a general audience listening to this conversation?
Okay, so the question is, who am I? You're getting straight in there.
That's the key question. It seems like it
Yeah.
seems so basic every day. I'm a school teacher, and on the first day we ask, who are you guys? Just tell me a little bit about yourself. But it kind of seems kind of superficial. So it's also it's one of the most superficial questions. Like, who are you? Oh, my name's Kyle, or my name's Tom. But also, it is the deepest question.
That's quite, yeah, I like the way you phrased that. It's a superficial question, it seems, and it's a question we don't necessarily think about, isn't it? And if you're talking about a general, wider audience, maybe people haven't really thought about who are they, what are they. So I think to a wider audience, that might be quite an esoteric question. That might be a question that doesn't have much relevance, actually. It might, even if you're a spiritual seeker, depending how you are exploring whatever kind of spirituality or non-duality or whatever your path is, whatever you're exploring, it might not even be an important question to a lot of spiritual seekers. Who am I? I know for myself, for much of my seeking journey, when I became interested in spirituality and things like this, that question, who am I, wasn't that important to me, actually. What was more important to me was that I was suffering, and it became obvious that I wanted the suffering to end. Like most people, I didn't want to suffer. And earlier on, maybe before I was sort of actively seeking spiritually, I would think, okay, I want to be happy, but suffering is inevitable. So I want to have a happy life. I want to live a good life, be a good person, and have a happy, productive, fulfilled life. But suffering is inevitable, and that's a part of the journey. And it was only when I came across this notion that perhaps suffering is not inevitable. And so for me, that was a massive thing. And that's what really, I think for a wider audience, maybe that's more of an important question initially. Is suffering inevitable? When I was younger, I'd heard this phrase, the human condition. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, the human condition. And we were basically taught that there is something called the human condition, and the part of what it is to be a human being is that you're born, you live, you're going to have some happy moments, you're going to suffer, life can be really tough, and then you're going to die. And then maybe something will happen after you die, depending on your belief system, or not, again, depending on your belief system. But suffering is a part of this life, and life is tough, and you just got to sort of do the best you can. Now, there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also something totally liberating, can be very profound when we realize actually this suffering isn't necessary. It doesn't have to be there. So maybe I know I haven't answered your question, who am I, what am I, but I think it starts off with, how can I feel better? How can I stop this suffering happening so much? How can I, and then it depends. Usually people will look around their lives and they'll look for what's causing them to suffer, and then they'll seek solutions that way. So, are they being bullied at school, for example? And is that the main issue? Are they not popular at school? Is that the main issue? Are they not doing well in their studies? Have they got a troubled home or family life? Do they not feel they're attractive enough? Do they not feel they're clever enough? Maybe they don't feel their personality is attractive enough, or their physicality is not attractive enough. So depending on where you see your deficiencies, And depending what you diagnose as being your problem, you'll seek happiness accordingly, isn't it?
So what
And
do you
it,
think, sorry to interrupt, but what do you think is from your experience, what has been the key like source of suffering throughout your life?
oh gosh, that's a good question. Because that is in a way the next follow-on question, isn't it? If you realize you're suffering, and then you're open to the idea that suffering is optional or there's an end to suffering, then it's, well, what's the cause what's the cause of suffering? Now, we've said there might be many different causes of suffering, but you've just in a way bypassed all that, and you've said, actually, maybe there's a root cause of suffering, maybe there's a singular root cause of suffering. This is what was implied in your question. And this is what the teachings tell us. The teachings tell us, yes, you can prune the tree of suffering. You can reduce your suffering. You know, imagine suffering as a tree with all these branches and leaves, and you know, different things are causing you to suffer in different areas. So maybe you don't think you're very attractive, and that's one branch of this tree of suffering, and that makes you suffer in one way. Maybe you haven't got enough money, so that's another branch from the tree of suffering that's making you suffer in a different way. You've got all these different things in your life that are making you suffer to a greater or lesser extent. And implied in your question is maybe there's one root cause of all these sufferings, and that's like the tree trunk. And this is what the great spiritual teachings teach us, using in different ways, using different concepts, using different language, using different cultural paradigms. They teach us that there's a root cause of suffering. And if we tackle the suffering at its root, then suffering ends. And that's what, to me, spirituality is about. And this comes back to your first question, who am I? And you don't have to talk about it in these terms, but one of the ways you can talk about it is by saying, well, when you discover who you really are, or what you really are, then the suffering ends. Because perhaps the root cause of suffering is a misunderstanding of what you are. Because you take yourself to be a limited entity, you take yourself to be a human being, a person, a limited entity, a body-mind entity. This is why we suffer. So that is when I look back, that is the root cause of all my suffering.
The desire to be a human being, or like the assumption that's like all that we are?
Yes, the latter, the assumption that what we are is a body-mind entity, and we're limited. So yeah.
Yeah. So how do you think most people, when they're especially because I interact with a lot of young people,
Mm.
I guess and you're a physician, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So kind of, I mean, some people who are very spiritual, they kind of get away from the general public, and because they kind of want to isolate themselves and say like,
Yeah.
okay, here's my spiritual area, and there's the rest of society that's not spiritual, right? Which is kind of like this dual system. So I'm wondering, like, from your experience, what is it like, kind of living a spiritual life and also be within the general public and interacting with a wide variety of people? How's that been in your experience?
It's been fine. Okay, you want more of an answer than that, I know.
I guess, like, yeah, just kind of a feeling that you receive, or the importance maybe of interacting with everybody.
um, so I think there's a truism there, isn't there, that a lot of people who are quite spiritual can sometimes retreat from what we would call everyday life, and maybe they don't have a job, maybe they don't have a family, and maybe they live somewhere remote, which is remote and beautiful, and maybe they spend their life just giving spiritual talks, which is not what most people's life is like. That's not what most people's lives are like. And my life isn't like that. As you mentioned, I am. Well, I have a family, I have a wife, I have children, I've got a busy job, I interact, as you quite rightly said, I interact with a lot of people daily. Now, someone could look at that and say, well, you know, Tom's got a more integrated form of spirituality there. He's talking to more people. You know, he's interacting with people. He hasn't divorced himself from life. He hasn't removed himself from life. But actually, I don't think that's, for me, this is just the way it happens to be for me. I haven't really chosen this in a way. This is, you could say this has chosen me, or this is just the way my life's panned out. I didn't choose to have this kind of apparently integrated life with a family. I mean, family and a busy job and a busy life. That's just the way it happens to be. I mean, I could have easily, maybe in a different set of circumstances, I could have been on a mountain in a cave somewhere, or, you know, not talking to anybody. So actually, it doesn't matter to me that much if I am interacting with. I don't think it's particularly important to interact with lots of people and have a life in the world, even though that's what happens to be happening right now for me, for Tom.
So you're saying that you didn't choose this lifestyle. Do you have any advice for someone who literally doesn't know how to live out their passion or figure out their dharma, their path? Some people, especially young people that I interact with, they just kind of feel lost and don't know which direction to go. What sort of advice would you give them?
It's really difficult. There's no easy answer. Personally, I mean, I do have these kinds of conversations with people all the time, and the advice I find myself giving does vary a lot from person to person. And I think these kinds of issues, there's everyone has their own unique situation, their unique circumstances. Some people know what they want to do, or it seems like they know what they want to do. Most of us don't, and most of us, when we're young, we don't know what we want to do, and when we get older, we don't know what we want to do either. It's not something that necessarily changes. You know, it's not like I know people who are, you know, into the, I guess you can say, the middle stage of their life, and they, you know, they might have had a job for many years, and they might have had a certain career. They might be very successful, but many people don't know really what they want to do. But life just kind of comes along, and before you know it, you're a certain age, and you've got a family, and you've got a job, and then you've got to keep the job to support the family and the mortgage, and then it becomes less maybe less a question of what do I want to do, and more like, well, you know, this is working, kind of, so let's just carry on and try and get through this thing called life and enjoy it as much as I can. And does that sound rather negative?
A little bit. It has a little bit of a pessimistic sound to it, but like, so, if you're in kind of within embedded in this pessimism, and like your life just seems hard, like paying the bills, going to work, trying to get exercise, and it just seems super mundane. Um, how does one find the beauty in it, though?
Well, the thing is, for me, life is not divorced from the spiritual. You know, this entire life, every moment is pure spirituality. It's just oozing and dripping with spirituality or spirit and the ineffable. And for me, it's that discovering that which is liberating, nothing else. Other things can come close, but they never actually do come close. So, for example, there are lots of things we can do to be happier. You know, we can eat right, we can exercise, we can interact with people, we can surround ourselves with positive people. And the various, you can try and figure out what you love to do and base your life around a passion, something that you truly love to do, if you can. And I mean, one problem is many people don't know what they would love to do. And then another thing is, well, you've got to try things. You know, you might have to try 20, 30 different activities or things of some kind, and then you might find one or two that you enjoy, really enjoy. Or you might have to try a few things many times. You know, it might be you don't enjoy it after the first or second time you give it a go, but on the fifth or sixth time, you kind of find a passion. So these are things you can do to make your life better. Yeah, better. But these things are all limited. These things will all satisfy you to a greater or lesser extent, but there'll always be that sense of suffering there, unfortunately, is my experience. And as long as you consider yourself to be a limited individual, as long as you do not have this connection with the spiritual, however that is for you, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to connect to the spirit in the way I am saying it, but you can discover it. It's the same discovery, but it can be phrased and experienced in sort of different ways. Without that, then everything is kind of transient. But there are lots of things we can do on that relative level, and I help people with that too. Again, it varies a lot. I think a lot of it's psychology in the West, because most of us have the basic human needs met. It's not a question of those sorts of things so much in the West. But then it's our psychology is a big thing. So things that I've noticed that hold people back are their relationship dynamics, how they relate to themselves and how they relate to other people. That's a big one. Understanding about psychological dependency, codependency in relationships, learning to love yourself, go easy on yourself, dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression. These are all problems that people face on a psychological level and on a relational level, and they have solutions to them on those levels. And so I often help, even though it's not the focus of the work I do with people, in the sort of, when I'm not working as a physician, when I'm, the capacity I'm talking to you now, Carl, is someone who sort of shares this non-dual message, this spiritual message. So when I'm working with people in this sort of spiritual way, we do touch upon those things as well, but the focus is always to connect with our essence, with something deeper, and that it liberates us. And then these sorts of problems of like, what do I want to do in my life, and how do I, the confusion that occurs with just confronting with life and what to do, it's these kinds of problems go away.
And how does can you define what non-duality is and how it would relate to some of these topics, these kind of everyday topics?
Well, non-duality is just a concept. It's just a word. It doesn't, again, that's the word I use. It's a translation of a Sanskrit word, Advaita. Advaita means, Dvaita means duality or two. And Advaita means non-duality or not two, as in the number two. So non-duality is basically saying there are, let's see, there's different ways of talking about it. Non-duality is essentially saying that what we're looking for, if we're a spiritual seeker, what we're looking for if we want to be happy in life, the happiness that we're looking for is not to be found anywhere else but right here, right now. It's not somewhere else. The liberation, the enlightenment that perhaps we're looking for, the end of suffering, is found right here, right now. It's not in a second place, somewhere else. So it's not like you have to sort of journey far and wide to some distant land to find something. It's right here, right now. So it's everywhere and everything right now. That's one way of expressing what non-duality can be. There are other ways of talking about it too. Another way of talking about it is in terms of subject and object. So what subject is me, and most people consider themselves to be a person or the subject, the observer or the doer, and they consider themselves to be living in a world full of multiple objects, multiple things, and objects includes everything we can perceive, other people, other things, and that's the basic paradigm in which we live our lives. We consider ourselves to be an individual living in a world of things. So we are the subject living in a world of objects. So this is called subject-object duality. Most people don't even think about this. This is just taken for granted as, yes, this is the way the world is. This is our a priori assumptions. about our life. We don't even question that. We just assume, yeah, I'm a person, I live in the world. And non-duality say, no, that's not true. You're not a person that lives in the world. This subject-object duality is an illusion. There's no subject-object duality. The idea that you are a separate entity living in a world of objects is not real. Now, that is difficult to put into words, as you can imagine, because what does that actually mean? If there's no subject-object duality, what does that mean? Well, it's the way things already are, but because we believe that we are the subject, our mind kind of creates this illusion that we are an individual person, and this is what creates our suffering fundamentally. And when this illusion of being separate, of being limited, is not there anymore, then all there is, we could say, is divinity, is spirit, is oneness, or bliss, end of suffering. And that's when all these problems go, all these sort of existential problems, such as what am I going to do with my life? I'm confused, I'm unattractive, I'm poor, I'm miserable, or I'm whatever problem you have. All these kinds of existential problems and worldly problems slowly just melt away. It's kind of like the kingdom of heaven is here.
Do you think suffering is actually a necessary first step to awakening? Because like the fact that suffering exists, it seems like there's kind of a selfish desire to get rid of that suffering for the self, like the like person or the subject, as you said. But then isn't there would the next step be like getting rid of that suffering? So would that be also getting rid of or kind of going beyond the ego?
Yeah. Yes, good question. But the thing is that your question was, do you think the suffering is necessary at the beginning? That's right, right? That was your question.
Yes, yes.
So I don't know the answer to that. But if you're suffering, see, if you're not suffering, you don't need these sort of spiritual teachings, because you're already living. You're already living in spirit. Let's say you're already living that non-duality, whether you know it or not. If you're not suffering, you don't need the teachings. The teachings only exist when there's suffering. And that's what creates the teachings. That's what creates the seeking. So the suffering is divine in a way. It's a divine suffering, because if you are suffering, it's that suffering that leads us to seek the end of suffering. That's the motivation to seek, to become spiritual. So this suffering is actually the cause of liberation, let's say, because the suffering exists, say, if it does exist for you, and then that makes us, go down various paths to try and relieve our suffering. Maybe when we're younger, we think, okay, if I get a new bike or a new toy, that would be brilliant, and that would be end of my suffering. And you get the new bike, and you're happy for like a day or a week or a month, and then you want something else. And then as you get older, you realize that toys aren't going to make you happy, but you want something else. Maybe you want a good career or a good relationship or whatever it is you're looking for. And then maybe these things give you some kind of happiness, but they don't fulfill you totally. You still feel there's something lacking, and then you might become a spiritual seeker. You might come across God or theistic traditions or Eastern traditions, and you might seek in this way. But the reason we do all this is because we suffer. And then it's through seeking and through failing to be fulfilled through various means, we realize what works and what doesn't work. We realize that, oh yeah, having the red Ferrari and the huge mansion doesn't fulfill me deep inside. Having huge amounts of cash, even though it's better than maybe being destitute, it doesn't fulfill me on some level. And then once we've tried all these different things, perhaps to a greater or lesser extent, or seen through the flawed strategies to seek happiness, then we come more towards spirituality. And then even within the spiritual scene, there are lots of things that just don't work. And my view is that then people come to the non-dual spirituality, which is the sort of type I'm sharing. I would say that, but wouldn't I? I'm a bit biased. I think my one is what I'm sharing is the cream of the crop. But that's my genuine experience of what I see happening to people. They go through all these different spiritual things and self-help things, which are all great for what they are. But do they give you lasting satisfaction? Do they allow that to happen? And so it's the suffering. Whether you need to go through that suffering at all, I don't know. My sense is you don't. Actually, my sense is you don't need to suffer at all. So, you know, but once the suffering's there, well, that's then hopefully what I'm sharing is a part of what can help alleviate that suffering.
To learn a little, to learn a little bit more about like your upbringing and kind of spirituality. What were some of those trials and errors that you kind of realized maybe like some immature spiritual moves or strategies that you used in the past, especially like when you were a teenager? Because I feel like when I was a teenager, I had a lot of teenage angst and existential crises and things like that, and that kind of led me into the path of spirituality. But I think when you're younger, you do kind of make these errors. So what were some of those errors?
Well, when I was younger, I was quite lucky. I came across an author called Jiddu Krishnamurti. Have you heard of him?
Yes, yes.
So you know,
There's another Krishnamurti named UG, but
yeah, there's a UG Krishnamurti and there's a Jiddu Krishnamurti. The Jiddu Krishnamurti, J Krishnamurti, he came first. He's the older of the two, and he is, you know, he's not for everyone, this kind of teaching. But one thing he does, he really strips away a lot of spirituality. He makes it very non-mystical. And he, you know, he says, I never read any of these big spiritual books. I never had a guru or a teacher. I didn't have to do all these sort of almost like bizarre rituals that you have to do in some kinds of spirituality, or wear interesting or exotic clothes. He kind of said no. He was against all that kind of stuff. He was probably more against it than I am now. But as a consequence of that, so he was anti-guru, anti-teachers, and he said there's no need to meditate, no need for spiritual practices. And so as a result of that, I didn't really pursue what I see a lot of people pursuing in vain. So, for example, you know, that all the pomp and ceremony that can come with spirituality, all the exotic, often Eastern stuff that comes with it, you know, interest, you know, all the clothes and the incense and
the chanting,
all that kind of stuff. I didn't get into that kind of. Now that thing is, it's not all bad. Don't get me wrong. I mean, for example, chanting. I think chanting is wonderful. I think it's a hugely powerful spiritual practice. So I don't agree with J. Krishnamurti and everything, but because I came across him, and I loved his writings, I really kind of became hooked on him. I read everything I could by him. I didn't go down a lot of wrong routes. Maybe what I did do, though, as I'm talking about it now, one thing is I think I was very intellectual with my spiritual seeking. I was seeking through concepts and ideas, and I found it very difficult to have any kind of faith or trust. But I think that's just the way Tom's wired. I'm not somebody who's interested in handing my faith or trust over to somebody else without some kind of sense that it's going to work, or, you know, I'm not into belief. Never really been into belief. And I don't know. I mean, I had a lot of insecurities when I was younger, but they weren't really mistakes I was making. It was more that I was very insecure about various aspects of who I was. Just working through those. But one of the things that helped me most with that really was meeting who is now my wife. And when we first met each other and we started going out with each other and things, the love I received from her and that loving relationship was incredibly healing. So that was in a way, that's a big spiritual practice. Just allowing someone's love for me to make me feel okay about who I was and who I am as a person. That was very healing. So, and that is a form of spiritual practice. You know, it's not something you can necessarily choose to practice, but if you're in a loving relationship, that's very powerful and very healing. If you're lucky enough to be in that position.
So as you kind of jumped from like, I guess from different paths to different paths, like in this sense of spirituality, like, and if you shift from one to another and then shift to another, what was like that bedrock or that like the thing that you trusted, or like like, was it your intuition the whole time that you trusted throughout your experiences?
Um, that's an awesome question. No one's asked me that before, I don't think. I think it must have been. I think it must have been. I think we're guided by our intuition and we're guided by our thoughts and our understanding at any point in time. So that's what guides us as spiritual. If we're seeking spiritually, we we seek teachings and teachers and methodologies that conform to what we think we know and that conform to our own experiences. I had an experience when I think I was about 18 years old. It was when I was reading a J. Krishnamurti book where it was like a oneness experience. It was like a timelessness and a oneness just happened while I was reading this book. And I realized how in this moment, things were not the way I thought they were. The sense of me dropped away. And there was just like the immediacy of just this happening, no subject, no object. There was a timeless quality to it. And then I spent years trying to get that experience back. So I think that guided me in a way. And that also was a mistake in a way, because my ego, I was trying to get the experience back, was actually is that excessive seeking after a experience, which prevents that experience from happening. But maybe I had to go through that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one thing that just kind of popped in my mind is some teachers talk about the differences between spiritual experiences and like the awakened state. I don't know if you've realized the difference or similarities.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps in my language, liberation is not an experience. Um, you could say experiences happen within this liberation. Or you could just say this is whatever's happening is liberation. But it's not a particular experience. A particular experience has a beginning and an end. So it's finite, and so it will end. Whatever begins will also end. So if you obtain something like an experience, you say you have a new experience, it will have a beginning, and then eventually it will end. And so no particular experience lasts forever. But liberation is always. It always is. It's already fully here. The problem, if there is a problem, and there isn't really a problem, so it's just an imagined problem. The problem is that there's a conditioning which is kind of here, which makes us believe that we're an individual living a life with free will and choice, whereas actually that's an illusion. And there's just this inexplicable oneness or divine wholeness, which those words are just words. I'm just trying to put into words what actually is very immediate and obvious, but can't really be put into words so simply. It's just a falling away of this duality, of this sense of being a separate individual.
Are there other teachers besides J. Krishnamurti that you read and had spiritual experiences through reading?
There are probably loads, because I read so many different teachings and teachers. The biggest one that comes to mind is I think I'm really considering. Well, I didn't have a proper teacher. I didn't have a teacher I followed or anything like that. I didn't have a guru in the traditional sense. But in many ways, I consider this person to be my guru, which is Ramana Maharishi. So many people will have heard of Ramana, but for those who haven't, he lived in India. He passed away in the mid 20th century, and he was an example of like let's say a holy person, a holy man who lived on a mountaintop, kind of isolated in a way. And he wrote very little down, but he always made himself available to people who were seeking. And he wrote a few things down, and he taught predominantly through silence. And so how can I consider this person, this gentleman who died well before I was born, to be my guru? Well, at one point in my seeking career, I came across his teachings. Actually, when I first came across his teachings, I wasn't that impressed by them at all. I just he just didn't impress me. His teachings just didn't really leave any kind of impression on me at all. But later, maybe a year or two later, after I first heard of him, and for some reason his teachings really grabbed me. I was at a place where they made a lot of sense to me, and it wasn't really them making sense to me. It's hard to explain. It was more that I had this inexplicable pull and gravitation towards Ramana, or what I felt was Ramana. And I started in a very non-logical way, a non-rational way. I started feeling a huge amount of love and devotion towards Ramana, towards this holy man who I'd never met before. And I sort of felt his presence, or what I thought was his presence. I mean, it just felt like his presence and a sense of who he was, an overwhelming sense of devotion and love. And I mean, that's profound. And I think that's really what led me to dissolve, led this sense of me to dissolve into this oneness. So Ramana's teachings are something I'm hugely grateful for. I consider Ramana to be my guru, my teacher. And if you resonate with these kinds of teachings, I'd always recommend Ramana's teachings as the ones to go to, because they're the ones that speak to my heart in a way that it's so strange, because being very sort of someone who's come from a very scientific and logical type background, someone who didn't want to have faith in anything, didn't want to believe, for this to happen to me it was quite surprising to me. In a way, it should have been quite disconcerting to me, but it wasn't. It felt so natural. But even when I read Ramana's teachings and I didn't like what he was saying, like if I read something and I thought, no, that's not right, I still just felt it didn't matter. It didn't matter if the words were wrong, or I thought the words were wrong. It was like this this inexplicable sense of devotion and love. It's quite remarkable, really.
So the love that was kind of, I guess, kind of pervading your environment, or the sense of you experiencing life, did you, since you do say that you just like your ego dissolved, like did you become, like what did you become, like you said, because you're saying that like you become the oneness, do you become the love, or which one is like more fundamental, like the oneness or like the love, I guess?
Yeah, we've got to be careful here, or I've got to be careful, because when I say words like oneness and love, it can sound quite grandiose. These are quite majestic and positive sounding words. It's just ordinary. So, but the oneness and the love are the same. It's not really oneness and it's not really love. They're just sort of, there are no words to describe it. So these are sort of words I end up using. I mean, it is oneness and love as well. So it just, the sense of that, of being an individual who is suffering, who has decisions to make, who has to do things, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole burden of being an individual. It's like we're carrying this huge weighted rucksack of all these things we have to carry around with us, and all the decisions we have to make, and our responsibilities and our fears and our desires and our worries and our anxieties, all this kind of stuff we're carrying around with us. And it's just like, that all just drops. So then and what you realize is that when you drop the rucksack, or the burden of you that you're carrying, the burden of being an individual, there's no one left. I mean, there's an apparent body called Tom who's speaking and stuff, but there's no one there really.
What about like even when you're really busy? I mean, as a teacher or a physician, how does can you kind of try to use words to explain that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's just what happens. It's just the way it happens. You know, it's like you get up in the morning. How do you get up in the morning? You know, how do you wake up in the morning? Well, you just wake up in the morning, don't you? You know, you could come up with a scientific explanation or a physiological explanation of why somebody awakes in the morning. You know, maybe you could talk about different hormones in their body, right? Like the cortisol levels rise, for example. That's one of the stimuli to help you wake up. But in your own experience, you just wake up in the morning, and then you eat your breakfast. Maybe how do you eat your breakfast? You just eat your breakfast. You know, how do you move your arms to brush your teeth, or you just do it, and then work comes along and you just do that too. And essentially the body mind just functions the only way and the best way it knows how to. It draws upon its skills and its resources to the best of its ability, and it's not perfect. You know, it's this body, Tom's constantly learning new things, and you know, making mistakes and hopefully learning from his mistakes, but not always. You know, so it's just the way it is. Sometimes it's stressful, sometimes there's a lot of thoughts going on, and sometimes it's not. But there's no suffering with all this stuff. So it can appear that Tom's suffering. It can appear that someone might look at me and think, oh, Tom's a bit, you know, stressed now or something. But my own experience is that it's all good. It's all fine and well.
Yeah, two questions here. So like the first one would be like with you were mentioning the thought process. What is the relationship between the suffering and the thinking process?
Well, I think when there's a thought that there's a me here, there's an individual, a separate body mind entity, then that creates suffering. When that's not there, then there's no suffering. But the thoughts can still occur. So for example, if I'm feeling thirsty, a thought might appear, oh, you know, I'm feeling thirsty, and why don't I get myself a glass of water? Then I get myself a glass of water. So that's completely practical type thinking. There's no problem there. But the sort of egoic thinking that is founded upon this foundational idea that I'm a separate, limited entity, that causes suffering. Does that make sense, Carl? I don't know how clear I'm being when I'm talking.
Well, that's an interesting actually question. Is like, what is it even important like to be clear in speaking about these ideas? Like,
No.
I guess what are you trying to get out of this like explaining?
Yeah, it's not important to be clear at all. Even teaching this is not important, because it's not anyone. This teaching doesn't belong to anybody, and the teaching is everywhere. What we're sharing in a way is just the verbal teachings. What we're also always sharing with each other and with ourselves is the non-verbal teaching, which is just every moment. So this is the real teacher is the genuine spiritual contact. The real teacher is genuine spiritual contact, and That's with us all the time. You don't need Tom or anything else. And perhaps that's what Krishnamurti was saying. Maybe that's what Jay Krishnamurti was saying. You don't need all this stuff, but it can still be a part of your journey. So this doesn't need to be shared, actually, because people will find it anyway. And we all know it. We all know it to be true anyway in our hearts, in the depths of our hearts. We know we're not limited entities. This is why we're seeking. This is why we know things can be so much better in our hearts. Doesn't matter how pessimistic we are. Do you remember at the beginning I was being a bit pessimistic? So it doesn't matter how pessimistic we genuinely feel our life, about our life. If we're open to our hearts tell us a different story. They tell us that life's wonderful. They tell us that life has so much potential. They tell us that our heart tells us that we are divine. We are limitless and we're divine. So we all have this basic intuition, and it just gets smothered up by our beliefs and our thoughts. But it can never be totally smothered. So this sharing doesn't have to be precise at all, actually. It doesn't have to be precise. But a flavor of it can sometimes come through. Sometimes through words, but sometimes through other means as well.
Despite the not needing to be clear, do you think it would be important for like the community of people who are into like the idea of consciousness, self-inquiry, meditation? Do you think there's an importance to create kind of a science where there is like a spiritual path through like that people can go through that would be similar to like the scientific method that we use today to use the physical world to understand the objects of the world? Could we do that for the meditator?
I don't think it's that helpful in a way. It might be for some. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it either. So this kind of stuff will inevitably happen. And it will be the more popular kind of spirituality because it's easier to grasp than what I'm talking about. If you set up a set of stages and you've got a scientific method by which it can all be done, it all makes sense. But and there are several of these sort of ancient methods around. I love the Vedanta methodology, the Advaita Vedanta, which is the non-dual Vedanta methodology. But the real teacher is this genuine spiritual contact, and that means the spiritual contact with that which is within us and which is all around us, and that's the true teacher. And also to have contact with a physically embodied teacher can be very helpful as well. That's more important than any structured teaching, because what you can have a structured teaching that doesn't actually have spiritual contact itself. Does that make sense? You have an empty, hollow structure. What's more important is having a realized being, as it were, that will guide you to the genuine spiritual contact. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What we're talking about is so simple. It's not other techniques can be a part of it. It's so simple. It's so direct, so immediate. The nuance of that will be lost unless there's a genuine realization.
Yeah, that's why I like the idea of the Tao, because it's not saying like it's an idea, it's like the way that it is. I don't know how some people who are, like, I mean, as a teacher, I see young people, and the saddest thing is that there's so much addiction to technology. It's like immediately opening up the phone, and there's just kind of a lack of being able to quote unquote see mindfulness, see consciousness, and with this lack, I wonder if they won't be able to see in the future like this Tao, this Taoism, this openness. I don't know if you think that's kind of going to be a hindrance for young people in the future.
Yeah, it is a hindrance in some ways. So again, this is something that I feel quite lucky about because Jay Krishnamurti talks about this. He says things, and I can't. It's been such a long time since I used to read him all the time, but something along the lines of, why do you need to go to art galleries and watch all these movies and things? Why, when we can just walk in nature? And he also talked about how we don't have to be psychologically dependent on things to make us happy, which is, we can find it. And he didn't phrase it in this way, but we can find a different source of happiness, which is not dependent on things. Because as we mentioned earlier, things are all limited. They have a beginning and an end. And so the happiness they bring is also limited. And then if you're relying on objects to make you happy, and when I say objects, I'm using it in sort of the widest sense of the word. So, whether it's a job or a person or a toy of some kind or a possession, if you're relying on these things to make you happy, you're going to be suffering, basically. They'll give you limited happiness, and then they'll give you suffering. And they perpetuate egotism. So in a way, like, yeah, having these busy lives where people are looking at cell phones, and it does cover it up more because the mind's busier and there's more substances to be addicted to. Like if you use the addiction model, these mobile phones, you can open up any time, you can surf the internet for hours and hours on end. I don't have a TV, and I recommend people don't have a TV. And the other day, I went on holiday with my family, and there was a TV in the room, and I was watching the TV. And I mean, one thing you notice if you don't have a TV, when you watch TV, television's weird. Yeah, it's so hyper, it's so weird, it's so bizarre. But I've not had a TV for years, so I'm used. If I do watch TV, I know I'm used to having that experience of how bizarre it is to watch television after having not watched it for a while. So that was fine. But what interested me was that because when I was younger, there were no mobile phones, and the internet was really just starting. It wasn't developed like it is now. So I didn't have the internet. I didn't have a mobile phone. But I had television. But what interested me about television is that, I was trying to flick through and find something that I wanted to watch. And there wasn't really anything that great on. So after about 15, 20 minutes, I just turned the TV off, having tried to find something to watch. But the internet, I'll almost always be able to find something that I can, like if I'm surfing YouTube, or whatever social media you're into, you can spend hours, any time of day, you could spend hours just watching your phone. So the potential for addiction to these things is much greater. So yes, this will cause much more clouding, but we don't have to worry about this stuff. There's nothing we have to worry about because it's all spirit. It's all spirit. So, and the other thing is that actually, you're reminding me a lot of when I was younger, actually, because I remember now I went through this whole phase of being very depressed about the world, the state of the world, how the political state of the world, the economic state of the world, all the gross injustices that were occurring, animal rights, animal welfare.
I think there's a German word for that. Do you have like schadenfreude or something? Have you ever heard of that word?
Yes. I can't remember exactly what it means. What does that mean?
It's just the idea that you have depression, but not because of you. It's just that you can sense all of the suffering, like just watching the news, knowing that there's a war in Syria, it just makes you sad.
Yeah, when I was in my early 20s, I think. Also, my family are from India. So I traveled to India several times with my family when I was a kid to see the rest of my family in India. I've still got much family in India. And then I think when I was in my late teens, early 20s, again, I'd been to India to see my family there. And I think I'd traveled around in India as well by myself at that point. And you see so much suffering, so much poverty. And then I came back to London, which is where I live. And, relatively speaking, even though I didn't have much money at that time, I was probably a student. Relatively speaking, I was, very, very affluent compared to what I'd seen in India. It was very depressing and heartbreaking for me. And then I started educating myself about the causes. I wanted to find the root cause of what's causing these political problems, so I started doing a lot of reading and research into politics, into economics. I started educating myself about these things because I've got a sort of more pure science background: physics, chemistry, biology, maths. I didn't really know much about politics or economics, so I started reading about these things, educating myself about these things and stuff, and getting quite depressed about the world, and then learning about how animals are treated. That was, and I became vegetarian when I was, I think I must have been in my early 20s. And there was all the angst and sort of bitterness and disappointment in the world, and then global warming as well. So I'm becoming more pessimistic again, Carl. Yeah. So all this stuff.
I had that same feeling when I was in my early 20s in college.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember talking to people about it, and most people around me, anyway, at that time, didn't feel that way. So there were a few people, but most people didn't, and that depressed me as well. How I felt, oh gosh, they're just turning a blind eye to it. So I sort of, in a way, I felt superior to them,
Yeah,
and
because you judge them for being like
yeah,
morally inferior.
yeah, exactly. I thought, I'm aware of all these things. Why aren't you aware? And in there's a subtle sense of superiority, and of course, there's a duality there because I felt different and cut off and isolated. Um, and the same thing can happen with spirituality. You say, with your mobile phones thing, there's a bit of that perhaps in there, which is like, with all the social media and mobile phones and negative images being blasted into the brains of the young people. Is this good? No, it's not good. I agree. And all we have to do is realize ourselves. We don't have to worry about other people realizing. We don't have to worry about other people finding out the spiritual truth. We don't have to worry about devising a system for someone else. We just got to realize ourselves. And when you realize yourself, it's hard to explain, but these problems go away. They don't really, I'm not saying don't help people, because you'll be moved to help in the way you're moved to help. And you can't help but be moved to help people in the way you are moved to help them.
That's
And
how
so,
I feel too.
yeah. So it's not a problem, but it's also a problem. So for example, I'm not in any hurry to give my children a mobile phone. I'll try and keep them away from a mobile phone for as long as I can. And like, as I said, we don't watch television in our household. Now, there are disadvantages to that as well, but I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And same with the mobile phones. There's advantages for children being familiar with these devices. But I think my personal view is that the disadvantages outweigh the advantages at the moment. So, yeah. Does it make sense?
Are your children surrounded by technology at school? Do you know?
They're not surrounded by technology at school, but they do get access to it in a learning environment. So it's a much more restricted way. And it's a very positive way in the school that my kids go to. I think that's true of most schools, especially in the UK. They're really introducing children to technology in a very positive way. So these technologies are seen as tools that we can use to help ourselves and help people around us, rather than let's just mindlessly spend our days consuming media of various kinds, and being overly stimulated and hyped up, and being whatever you happen to be watching or consuming on the social media or other types of media, and also being exposing the child's brain to all these kinds of behaviors, and that a child or an adult could think are normal ways of behaving. When you watch television, cinema, people are acting in a certain way, and that's not necessarily reflective of a healthy way of being. So, yeah.
Yeah, to kind of go back to kind of the sadness that you feel thinking about, like, especially climate change, that seems really, really, really kind of a strong sense, because it might be the most like influential future event that happens to especially young people. How would you put that in the context of like spirituality, okayness?
Oh, I don't feel that kind of sadness about it now. That's what I felt in my early 20s. Now I do see it as an issue, you know, but it's not something that bothers me too much. But I'm not saying it is an important issue, but it's not something that bothers me in terms of it doesn't cause me angst. It's more like a problem that we need to solve. It's more like a practical problem we need to solve, and we're either gonna solve it or we're not, you know. And so we should do our best to try and solve the problem.
Seems like it could also be a lesson to be learned as well.
In what way?
So like just the idea of, I mean, maybe it's here for a reason. Climate change is for a reason, and that kind of the idea that humans can't consume the entire world, and maybe that's just kind of a lesson to be learned. But I don't know if you see that from your point of view.
Well, you know, the thing is that this world is actually just a reflection of ourselves. With the non-duality thing, what happens is that well, again, I'm putting into words what is non-verbal, but this entire world is just yourself. That's one way of phrasing it. So it's not like there's other people out there. You know, it's not like there's any separation. It's all you. It's all you. It's all a reflection of you. It is you. So this is your doing.
Yeah, it seems like once you realize that, like the issue of climate change would just drop. It would just not be seen as an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue and it isn't an issue. Ultimately, it's not an issue. It's like getting your haircut. You know, say you want to get your haircut. Is that an issue? Well, not really, but you still might want to get your haircut because there's something you still, just because it's not an issue doesn't mean you don't cut your hair. So I'm not saying it's not an important issue. I don't want anyone listening to this think, oh, you know, Tom Das doesn't care about climate change. I do. Or Tom doesn't care about X, Y, or Z. It's not that. It's just that, yes, these are issues that need to be solved. And that's it. I don't know if that, but this is also at the same time all us. It's all us. It's all one. That's why you can spend a lot of energy trying to stop global warming, and I wouldn't stop you doing that, and if you wanted to do that. But why not realize who you are? Why not realize the self? Why not discover this spiritual contact? Why don't you discover this true spirituality that's all around us, that is us, that is oneness, that is divine? And then see if you still care so much about all the social problems. And you might do. You might still care about these social problems. You know? Don't let me tell you otherwise.
Are there any other topics that you feel are kind of pertinent and related to this, but I haven't asked it to you yet? Any similar topics?
There are probably loads. Because the thing is that there's so many different aspects of the teaching. And I don't necessarily have a fixed teaching. It's just what emerges in the conversation. Like we've had a dialogue, and because of who you are, Carl, you brought out a particular aspect of me, you know. And if it was someone else, they would bring out a different aspect of the teachings. What I find happens with me is that when people come to me seeking answers to their questions, or seeking for their suffering to end, or seeking direction in their life, I, generally speaking, am able to just meet them where they are and guide them in a way that often saves a lot of time, because I feel that what happens is that I'm able just to see immediately where the sticking points are in a way that they haven't been able to for themselves. It's always easier for someone else to see what the issue is with you rather than you see it about yourself anyway. And then when there's no actual egoic process occurring here, it's very easy to see where that is happening with someone else. So just pointing these things out, just seeing the sticking points, seeing where ego is still having its hold, having its sway, allowing, and then being a catalyst to allow that egotism to drop away. That's pretty much what I do, I think. And there are lots of different ways I do that, depending on the person I meet. Sometimes it'll be about specific practices, sometimes it's about devotional practices, sometimes it's about chanting, sometimes it's about self-inquiry.
I guess we could kind of get into, I guess, the nitty-gritty of self-inquiry. How would you want to like introduce that practice?
Oh, how long have we got then, from your point of view?
I have I have a lot of time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, I'm not too prescriptive really. So I wouldn't necessarily raise self-inquiry unless, so, I mean, it's quite, as I said earlier, there is no real teaching unless there's seeking. So for me, there's nothing to teach. But then if someone asks a question, then the response comes from that. So if someone asks a genuine heartfelt question that's to do with their own suffering and their own seeking, then there's a response from me. You can call that a teaching. But often if it's a more kind of conceptual question, Tom, I've noticed, or me, I've noticed that I'm not very good at necessarily, I could give you an answer. Don't get me wrong, I could give you an answer about self-inquiry. But I don't know, there's a reluctance to do so.
Yeah, I can come up with kind of maybe a very genuine question that I would have. I'm thinking of now. I'm really diving into the idea of service to other people and even animals. What do you think would be the relationship between kind of putting your energy towards service for the purpose of service, but then also maintaining your career in the sense that you are wearing this identity or you're wearing this hat in the context of this like kind of imperfect society. Kind of, you could say an example, British culture or American culture, they have their own sets of values, but then you might have this idea that, I've kind of realized that there's this sense of me, this sense of I am that goes beyond this society. But I want to bring that down to the real world, but I'm living in this context of a particular culture. How would you say, what advice would you give to someone like me that has that kind of, is living from that mentality currently?
So what are you trying to achieve?
I'm trying to really like I kind of sense like in the moment, each moment throughout my day is what needs to be done, not just to like, how can I serve, like if I'm hungry or I'm tired, I eat, I sleep, but also other people have needs, and you can kind of sense it non-verbally, which is kind of an advantage through once you have kind of practiced meditation, mindfulness, yoga, you have this ability to sense suffering, not just that you have, but also through others, people, animals, etc. So that's kind of I guess the sense of achievement.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I don't claim my teachings are right for everyone. So people who usually come to me, they're usually drawn to me for some reason, and that's why they're approaching me. So in that context, I feel comfortable giving my advice because people have come to me seeking advice. I'm like, okay, well, you've sought advice from me. I'm happy to give it to you and I'm happy to try and help you in any way I can. So in a way, that's the service I offer. And so, I mean, I'm assuming that's sort of the spirit which you were asking the question as well. You know, you've reached out to me and you know, asked if we could have this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. If I could make a kind of a comment on that, is definitely I have one of my drives is the unselfish drive to introduce big ideas to a wide variety of people, because, but it's also a selfishness also because I want to think about these ideas and I want to decrease my suffering in my life too. So I think it's kind of a mutual benefit.
It's a win-win, isn't it?
Right, right.
Yeah, which is great. I think that's wonderful.
So I generally try to ask unselfish questions that like other people would have, but also sometimes I might ask a question that I generally like, I want to know some advice for this.
Yeah, and that's what a good interviewer does, I think. You know, they ask questions on behalf of others and also for themselves. The difficulty for me is that I actually haven't got much motivation to share this. You see, I um I I don't really have that much motivation to share it. But what happens is that when someone is genuinely seeking, and I'm confronted with that person, that creates a drive in me to share. So it's the other I feel like the seeker pulls the teaching out of me. So that's why if someone's asking a question that's quite conceptual, even though I can answer it, you know, because Tom has read so many different books, he's got all the, you know, I know all the theory, so I can just spit out an answer. Doesn't really interest me that much. But when someone comes to me with a genuine question, that pulls a response out of me. And that's where the teaching comes from, I feel. That's what seems to be happening at the moment and recently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yep, it does.
So your question was about, so sorry, I've lost the question. And you did say it. Oh, say it again, sorry.
Yeah, and I think I want to word it even better. So like, for me, as I've gone, I mean, I've probably been seeking spiritually seeking for 12 years. And now I've kind of reached this realization where like everything is enlightenment.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter if I identify as enlightened or not, or even if I believe I am or not. All it is like, because everything is enlightenment, um, I have the desire to live in it, and I have the desire to see it in others. And I feel that service and like, there's actually a Christian phrase is God's love our hands, or something like that. So it's the idea is you sense the essence of Godness, but then it's manifested into being a teacher, going for a walk, taking care of animals, things like this. So I guess I don't really know if that's a question, or I just.
No, when you've rephrased it, I've remembered I remembered the answer that was coming when you asked it before now. And it's the same answer again, which is, so you come to this sort of realization on some level that this is all liberation, this is all divinity. The duality between spirit and not spirit, or spirit and matter, is false duality. You know, this is the spirit, this is the spiritual. And so then you could ask a question. You mentioned Christianity, so I want to mention God. You know, what does God need from you? Yeah. Now, really, what I would say is God doesn't need anything from you. God's doing just fine. Yeah. God doesn't need your service. So I'm going against that phrase that you said, like, you know, I think you said, was it God's love and your hands?
God's love our hands.
Our hands, yeah, meaning that God loves us, but we've got to do the work. I would say, do you remember the Bible story of Mary and Martha?
I actually didn't really grow up Christian.
Oh, okay. There's a wonderful story in the Bible, in the New Testament. So the New Testament contains the stories of Jesus in the first four books in the Gospels. And there's a story in the Gospels where Jesus visits the house of two sisters, Mary and Martha. He goes into the house, and Martha is sort of cleaning the house, running around the house, doing all the household work, you know, doing all the shopping. She's basically the practical person in the house. And when Jesus comes along, she goes, "Oh, thank God you've come along, Jesus. Can you tell my sister Mary to help me, please? Because I'm doing everything, and all she does is pray to God or worship God." And then Jesus goes to Martha, who's the one who's running around, and says, "Martha, Mary has the right idea." And the idea is that you've got one person who's trying to save the world and do all the practical stuff. You've got the other person who's very impractical, just devoting themselves to God. And Jesus praises the devotion to God, which is something that's very difficult to swallow, because Martha's the one actually doing all the work. Do you see? And the notion is that God doesn't need your help. Just relax. And God will show you the way. And if God doesn't show you the way, that doesn't matter. And you know what? When you have that attitude that it doesn't matter, then God will show you the way. You'll be led. And you may help lots of people. You might run around the community, help lots of people. Or you might do what Ramana did and end up just sitting in a cave, sitting on a hill for the rest of your life and not helping people. Because this world is mysterious. What you think is helping people might not be the greatest help. And what you might think of as being lazy and unhelpful might be the greatest help. Look at Ramana. Look how many people he's inspired and taught. You know, countless people. And people said to him, why don't you travel and teach? And he said, how do you know I'm not doing that already? How do you know that my silent power is not emanating already? Because the teachings work mysteriously. They transcend time and space and your hands, you know? It's not all about you and what you have to do. So don't feel like if you have a sense that you want to do something and give, then but I'm no way going to stop that. But it's not something you have to do. And I think if you're open to that, and maybe you know this already, I don't know, and maybe God doesn't need your help. God doesn't need you to sort of help others, but then you might still do it.
Yeah, that's kind of a gray area, right? Like Kyle's desire to help others versus like what is meant to be happening in the moment, through God. It's hard to.
Yeah, you can't figure it out. You can never figure it out. You don't have to either.
I'm fine with leaving it pretty ambiguous.
Yeah. And what I noticed is that in some ways I became less caring when the suffering ended. Because what I didn't realize was that a lot of the times I was caring, in quotes, but actually I was just trying to feel good about myself, and then I could say I'm a caring person.
You must have been caring by nature, kind of for your desire to become a physician.
Yeah,
kind of in your background.
That's right. I mean, it's a caring profession essentially. I mean, obviously not some doctors are more caring than others, but essentially it attracts people to it that want to help. In general, I mean, there are other reasons people go into medicine as well, but for the most part, most people who become doctors, they want to help in some way. And yeah, I just noticed that sometimes I was trying to be there for somebody so I could feel like I'm being there for someone. And then when I no longer felt the need to have that self-image as a caring person, and some of that fell away. And actually, I could be a lot harsher in some ways, but it often ended up for the best for everyone.
Yeah, because it's kind of like a nonverbal, or even kind of, I said our hands, God's love our hands, but not even a hands way of helping. It's just, it is, and that's okay.
Exactly. So did that help your genuine question in any way at all? What did you take from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Is like the ambiguity of it, like kind of the gray area of, I have this, if I could find this quote from, it's about happiness from Leo Tolstoy.
Mm-hmm.
If I could actually read the quote, that just really reminds me of that. It goes, give me 1 second here for it to load.
Yeah.
So he's describing his idea of happiness.
Hmm.
And he goes, quote, "A quiet, secluded life in the country with the possibility of being useful to people to whom it is easy to do good and who are not accustomed to have it done to them, then work which one hopes may be of some use, then rest, nature, books, music, love for one's neighbor. Such is my idea of happiness."
Mm.
So I really love that quote, especially um, then work which one hopes may be of some use. So like when I have this desire to help people or even help myself, it's not that I know for sure that it's helping. It's that I hope, or all I can do is hope that it's helping. You
Yeah.
can't know it. It's just kind of a sense of like I am efforting to bring goodness.
Yeah. It's the intention, isn't it? Your intention is to help.
Right.
Whether or not it will help, you don't know, but you try your best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any other what did you get out from that quote?
The quote you just read,
Yeah. What
the way I saw it was, it's a particular version of happiness, actually, and it's a particular version for a particular person. That's the way I read it, because the true happiness is not from external things, but for a person, they will have their own version of happiness, depending on their conditioning. You know, and that's the same for me as well. You know, what I like to do, what I consider to be happiness in my daily life is going to be different for someone else. Someone else might like to play golf all day. For me, that might be hell. You know, so I just see that as it's interesting, and it's interesting. I find it. So I thought my first uh, um, thought was that that's a particular version of happiness, and then I found it really interesting, and I thought it was really nice how you drew inspiration from it and how it spoke to you. It didn't necessarily speak to me in the same way it spoke to you,
right.
with depth, but I really liked that. I really liked that you liked it, and I really liked how you found sort of inspiration in the words and the specific in and I think you appreciate the language as well. The sort of, I mean, I'm assuming it's a translation because obviously,
Yeah, from Russian.
yeah, from the Russian, but I felt you had an appreciation for the actual words and language as well, which was quite nice. Is that right?
Right. I mean, I enjoy reading quotes like that, especially from my favorite authors like Tolstoy or Thoreau, people like that.
Yeah. So I think I was getting that kind of the art, the appreciation of the artistic quality of the language as well, the the aesthetic quality of the language, as
Yeah,
well as
kind
sentiment. So that's what I got from the quote. You know, it was more me seeing what you got from it.
yeah, absolutely. It kind of depicts like kind of an ideal retirement for myself is like, you know, out in the woods, but helping neighbors, reading books, listening to music.
Hmm. And it has a sense of a simpler life about it as well, doesn't it? You
Yeah.
know, he didn't say, I want to be at home on my iPhone, you know, on Tinder, you know, updating my Facebook page. You know, that's not, it's not that kind, it's a different kind of simpler life, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, and he's also describing happiness just for himself. Like he just says at the end, such is my idea of happiness. He's not saying like this is the one path to happiness.
Yeah, exactly. So he's not preaching, which is nice.
Yeah, very good. So, how can people connect with you if they want to have a chat or want to meet you or anything?
Oh yes. Just well, how did you connect with me?
I found out about you through Buddha at the gas pump.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I've got a website, tomdas.com, which is my name, tomdas.com, and there's a contact section there, and you can contact me. I try and make the what I share really available for anyone who's interested. So every Thursday I do a meeting, And I do 2 online meetings a month. And so anyone from anywhere in the world can sort of just come in on Zoom and ask me a question or just share the space with me. And in London as well, we meet twice a month as well. And the details are on, you can access it through my website, which is probably the simplest way. I've also got a Facebook page, and I've got an Instagram page as well now, which I sometimes put posts into. And I think I've got a Twitter account as well. And I've got a blog, which is on my website. And the blog contains a lot of written teachings over the years. It contains a whole load of different teachings. And I try and put stuff on that that inspires me. So as inspiration hits, I'll write something. But I also tend to post things that maybe people won't find elsewhere so easily. Some of the really wonderful, deep spiritual teachings, especially the traditional teachings, that are wonderful and wonderfully powerful, that haven't really necessarily made their way to the West or to the Western consciousness in a very full way yet. So there's a lot of wonderful traditional teaching from India and around, from Asia in general, which it's still not really taught very widely, and they're hugely beneficial teachings. So I try and sort of declutter that and unravel that and make it accessible. Have I left anything out? How else can people, is that right? How else can people contact me? I don't know.
Not to put you on the spot, but what's one of those practices that you're referring to?
You mean the sort of Eastern traditions?
Yeah.
I think they're less so specific practices, more like a whole different range of techniques and practices. But the non-dual teachings, the non-dual Vedanta teachings, my experience is that what in the West we're still learning as Vedanta is not, for the most part, the deep, the true Vedanta. So Vedanta is this, it's a, for those of you who haven't heard of it, I guess it's a teaching that teaches liberation and freedom. It points out what I'm sharing, and it teaches the end of suffering. And it can be quite difficult to access because these teachings were written in a different language originally, in an Indian language called Sanskrit. And a lot of the translations that were done, they were done decades ago. And so the language is quite antiquated. And when the translations were made, there wasn't that much understanding of Vedanta in the West, even less than there is now. So on my website, there's a whole load of stuff that goes to that in more detail. And there are a few books you can read about it. And there's a book called Advaita Buddha Deepika, which means non-dual lamp of realization. And it's basically, the idea of that title is that it's a lamp guiding people towards non-duality. And it sets out the whole teaching, well, almost the whole teaching in that one book. You can find it online for free and have a read of that. So I recommend people do that if they're interested. And on my website, I put loads of different posts. I've got, if you don't want to read a whole book, you can just do searches on my website. I've written on most of this stuff. And so the written teachings are all available for free on my website, tomdas.com. So again, if you search Advaita Buddha Deepika, that's ADVAITA space BODHA space DEEPIKA, Advaita Buddha Deepika. You can see the articles I've written on it, and I've put quite a few excerpts on there. It's just some wonderful teachings, very simple, hopefully fairly accessible. But there's a lot of what I've noticed in the spiritual scene is that you've got 10 different spiritual teachers, they've got 10 different teachings. And one teacher says this about an aspect of the spiritual path, and another teacher says the opposite, and another teacher says, no, neither of those two are right, this one's right. And it's like, what do you do? Well, the wonderful thing about the Indian traditions and the Asian traditions is that you've got hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition, and they've kind of figured a lot of these problems out for us. So if you go to the scriptures, you will often find some beautiful teachings that cut through all the rubbish. because they've gone through, they've figured it all out, and they've figured out what works, and they've thrown away what doesn't work, and they tell you what mistakes to steer clear of, and what path you should go down, and the reasons why, in a lot of detail. So these texts are wonderful gifts to us. The difficulty is, as I said, most people don't make the effort to read the text, because initially it's not always the easiest thing to read. You know, they can be a bit, they use different language, and it's a different way of looking at the world, and it's easier to listen to a teacher. But the problem is that, and this isn't just with spirituality, this is with everything, you have to go to the source material if you want to find out what the real truth is. You can't just listen to an expert, because you'll find that when you dig into the subjects, the experts get things wrong in many ways. You know, for example, Buddhism. When I first came across Buddhism and I was listening to people talk about Buddhism, then I read the actual scriptures, the actual Buddhist texts. They were worlds apart, you know. And when I was younger, I used to go to a Buddhist temple for a while and try and understand the teachings. And then I realized half the people didn't know any of the Buddhist scriptures, and what they were teaching wasn't really what was in the scriptures at all. But you don't know that unless you make a study of the scriptures. You know, same with many things in life, you know. So, you know, if you want to understand the truth about science, you've got to read the scientific papers. And when you read the scientific papers and the scientific studies, it's not always exactly what you were perhaps told otherwise. You know, it's slightly nuanced, slightly different. The same is true with the spiritual teachings. We've got a good few centuries worth of scriptures that have done all the hard, heavy lifting for us, so we can make use of them. And hopefully I try and make that available. There's another wonderful text, very short text. Well, there's a very, very long text called Yoga Vashista, which is probably the longest non-dual book or longest non-dual scripture. Beautiful, beautiful scripture. And even though it's very lengthy, it's actually one of the more easy to read ones. You don't have to read all of it. It's like hundreds and hundreds of pages long. But you just read any 20 pages of it, and it will teach you the teachings. And I think it was a few hundred years ago, a sage took out some key verses from the Yoga Vashista called Yoga Vashista Sara, which means the essence of Yoga Vashista. And I've recently blogged that on my website for free. So you can read that and you can see the teachings there. But again, you know, it's what you're drawn to. You know, not everyone's going to be drawn to these things. So
yeah, for me, for example, I'm really drawn to variety because like for me, I see like some really smart woman is speaking. I'm like, yeah, she seems quite right. But then I can point out like 3 things that she's wrong about. And I jump to someone else who's talking about a totally different subject. I'm like, yeah, they're partly right as well.
Yeah, I'm like that too. Yeah, I'm quite eclectic. I'm interested in different things.
Yeah. It's hard to be like, it seems like every like couple months I find this new idea and I dive into it 100%. And then I find something new 3 months later. But there's always been this constant of, I've always had this passion for trying to know or wanting to know, or even sometimes finding truth, but then realizing it's not the full truth, getting frustrated. But it's always like this desire. That's kind of been the constant.
Do you mean the desire for liberation?
I think so. I think it's not just, it's liberation and understanding what liberation is, and not just like for like a person, but kind of the realization of like truth, knowing that it is true.
But I mean, isn't it that you want, this is a question to you, isn't it that you want to understand liberation so you can experience it?
I think so. I think it's.
So if you had a choice between understanding it or actually having it, you'd want it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the
And
suffering,
the understanding is just the means to the end. But the problem
Right.
is that the correct means? It might be, it might not be.
Right.
So this is the what your path in that sense mirrors mine. I was seeking through concepts, which is what initially happens to everyone almost. Not everyone actually, but it happens to a lot of people, and it's one way. But we always will once your mind and heart has been open to liberation or enlightenment or self-realization or whatever you want to call it, or God, whatever you want to call it, however you phrase it, you won't let go of it. And you might be interested in other things like global warming or animal rights or whatever it is, or doesn't matter what it is. It will always come back to this because your heart will not find the rest and the peace and the love it deeply yearns until it is united with itself fully. It's just the way it goes, because this is what you are. This is your nature. Your nature is this love and light and wholeness, and your heart knows this already, but then you go off seeking here and there elsewhere, and that causes pain. So your heart longs for this unity to be manifest, and so it won't let it go. And what usually happens to most people is that, excuse me, they'll do some spiritual seeking, and they'll be interested in something else, and then they'll do some spiritual seeking, and they'll be interested in a few other things. But eventually the suffering will get worse and worse, or intensify, and the other things you're doing will become less and less important because they don't remove that suffering. And then eventually the spiritual seeking becomes more and more important. And it gets to the point where the spiritual seeking becomes everything. It just becomes so intense. And this is when you're spiritually becoming much riper to receive the teachings. Because these spiritual teachings, or maybe not even teachings, but this spiritual sense consumes you eventually. And you're not even left anymore. There's not a you anymore. There's just the spirit. There's just spirit.
Yeah, not even the desire to hold a job, or
No.
even that doesn't arise.
No. I mean, yes and no. So intrinsically there's no desire, but that desire, generally speaking, still occurs because the body needs to function and maintain itself. There's a natural intelligence energy that looks after everything. That's already looking after everything, It's already, digesting your food and thinking your thoughts and providing you with air and food and all this, this natural intelligence energy is already functioning all the time. It's all there is, actually. There's no one, it's just that we think that we're doing this. We're moving our arms and legs. Actually, it's just all happening through intelligence energy or God or the power or source or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so decisions will be made, but not by you.
Yeah, and in most non-dual traditions, they'll say already that's the case. The difference is you think you're doing it now. So Ramana talked about how on the sides of these temples, you often get these statues, which there's a column holding up the temple roof. But on the front of the column will be carved a sort of gargoyle or a monster that looks like it's holding up the roof, But it's just the carving on the stone. It's not actually doing anything. It's the column behind it that's actually bearing the weight, you see. But he says, you're like the gargoyle on the temple. You think you're holding up the roof. You think you're doing something really important. And if you let go, the roof's going to collapse. So you've got this huge amount of anxiety, this burden of being a person you're carrying around with you. But actually you're a superficial nothing. So this is a bit like our predicament. We think we have to make all these decisions and do all this stuff and, help people or whatever it is. But God's already got this. We don't. So we don't have to worry about it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So that sometimes manifests itself as surrender teaching, surrender to God. But we don't have to. We just have to. God's already got this.
Yeah, you don't have to try to surrender. You can just be.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. And there's no you. There's not even a you. You think there's a you. This is now self-inquiry now. So now we're naturally coming on to, this is how the teaching naturally unfolds, through a conversation in this instance. Self-inquiry, you look and say, well, you know, if I'm making these decisions, if I'm doing things, and if I'm confused, who is this I? What is this I that's confused? And what Ramana says, if you look, you won't find anything. And all there'll be is your true self, without thoughts, thoughtless reality. Your true self. In the Sanskrit way of saying things, they call it the Atman, which means self or you. So they say you just find yourself, but you don't find any decision maker or any doer, any individual entity anywhere. What happens? Just thoughtless reality is just here.
Yeah, it has to be thoughtless, right? Because if you have a mental construction of who you are, you're trying to find it in space and time, like, oh, I'm here. But that's going to be one point within like all that could be. So if it's truly non-dual, I mean, not the idea, but it should be the realization that you are the everything rather than a particular thing.
Well, it's just that what you are is non-conceptual. You can't put it into words. So
Yeah.
it's not having a new concept, like I'm everything or anything like this. It's just removal of the wrong concepts. The wrong concept is I'm limited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But saying I'm unlimited is also incorrect if it's an idea.
Correct. It might be something that it might be a part of a teaching methodology, but ultimately that even is thrown away. So for example, you might repeat as a mantra to yourself, I am unlimited, I am infinite, you know, I am God. And this is a way of uprooting the limited beliefs. I am limited, I'm a body mind, I am small, I'm weak, I'm vulnerable. So sometimes the traditions, they advocate repeating the opposite thought, which is I'm infinite, I'm invulnerable, all this kind of stuff, you see. But that's just to remove the wrong thought. And then you let go of that too. So you're not left with any concept. But Ramana's self-inquiry, the different ways of talking about it, I've done a whole video on it on YouTube. So I've done quite a few videos. So if people want to explore my teachings further, you can see my channel on YouTube. And I've done a video on self-inquiry. But simply, so who are you? What are you? You look, you can't find it yourself. And then you just stay there.
Is it similar to, what's it called? The neti method?
It's not the same method, but there are similarities. The neti method is a method done with the mind, where you say, I am not the body, I'm not the mind, I am that, you see? So it's more like you negate with the mind. The mind says, I'm not this, I'm not this, and I'm not this. Anything that's perceived, I'm not. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. I'm not the subconscious, all this stuff. I am pure consciousness. Whereas this is, you look, this is more of an investigation rather than an affirmation. This is more of an investigation. You can look into your experience and say, oh, I'm confused. I don't know which way to turn, or I'm suffering. Well, what's suffering? Who's suffering? Well, I'm suffering. Well, what is this I that is suffering? Let's look. You have a look.
But it doesn't end it doesn't really end the suffering. It's just like changing the perspective that I'm not the thing that suffers, right?
Try it. That's what thought says. When thought comes back in again, thought says, well, this isn't really doing much. But then what Ramana says, you say, well, who's thinking that thought? I'm thinking that thought. Well, who is this I that's thinking the thought? And you go again, you come back to thoughtless reality. When the thoughts come back, you say, well, who's thinking the thought? And it keeps on taking you back to thoughtless reality. And the thoughts go. When the thoughts go, the thoughts are what's veiling the reality. The thoughts are what, because we're constantly engaging and looking at things through our thoughts, we're using thought as a tool. Thought is actually what's creating the problem. So when the thought goes, this is when the reality manifests itself. But we're trying to figure it out with the mind, which is actually the sense of separation. So this is never found by the mind. You can't get it. Which is why when I want to understand it, I thought, you know what? I want to understand this. I want to devise a method so everyone else can get this, and then share it in a very clear, articulate way. That's what I wanted to do when I was seeking. I thought, I want to get this. I want to understand it. I want to figure it out. I want to lay it all out and then share it in a very clear way with everyone, a very logical, structured way, so everyone can get this. It's too simple for that. It's too. The mind can't get it, but it's what you already are. But the mind thinks you're something else. The mind's getting in the way.
So there's some types of meditation that might actually just get in the way of that whole process.
Oh, completely, yes. It depends where you're at. What might get in the way for one person might help another. It's whatever needs to, it's the egoic mind that needs to be removed. The mind that keeps on thinking in terms of subject, object, me, other, needs to be removed. Most practices reinforce that. Self-inquiry is one of the few that doesn't. But almost every single spiritual practice reinforces a sense of me and other. Carl, can you excuse me for a second, actually?
Yes.
Hello again.
Okay. Do you remember your thought?
Yeah, so we're just saying that it's more that I think you had a glimpse into the fact that certain practices could be a hindrance, certain meditations could be a hindrance. They're reinforcing sense of me. They're reinforcing concepts. Whereas this is all about demolition. This is all about bringing the house down. So there are lots of different ways you can demolish a building. Yeah, we don't have to argue about which way is best. We'll just get to work to doing it, whichever way works best for you. You see, and what you don't want to do is start telling other people how to do it, because they might have a different way that, you know. From my perspective, you know, all these different methods, as long as it's bringing the house down, bringing down the ego, bringing down egotism, it's all good. And then when you're not bringing down, when you're building it up, then that can be pointed out. And if there's a genuine seeking, the seeker will go, oh yeah, thank you so much, Tom. You pointed out where I was building up egotism. Thank you. And there's a falling away, you see. There's lots of different ways of, if you came to me and said, oh yeah, I'm demolishing my ego this way, I'm like, yeah, it's fine. There are countless ways of doing it. They usually end in self-inquiry or something similar, or love. For me, it was more love. It was more this love that overwhelmed me for Ramana. So some of the most amazing practices you can have is a devotional practice, silent practice, self-inquiry practice, chanting practice. And you'll be drawn to the one that works for you, because your heart will take you to the teaching and the teacher that you need. So if you need to do some chanting, you'll feel like doing some chanting. If you don't need to do some chanting, you probably won't feel like doing some chanting. Although some people need to do chanting, but they're just too sort of closed up. You know, they're too restricted. You know, they're too uptight. And these people, if they let go and relax a bit, then it'll be good for them.
It seems like the self-inquiry process must happen more than one time, especially, I mean, it has to happen thousands, hundreds of thousands of times, because the arising of the ego arises naturally. Like, and if you self-inquire into the ego back and forth, eventually there's going to be this point where the self-inquiry becomes natural and the ego becomes unnatural.
That's it. That's exactly it. Let me, well, anyway, there's a text called Who Am I by Ramana Maharishi. Have you read it?
No, I have not.
This is an example of a sort of, I mean, it's quite a modern text. It was written in the 20th century, but it's the seminal text on self-inquiry. It's only a few pages long. And most people who are doing self-inquiry have never read it. You can, I'll put it, again, I've blogged it, so you can search for it on my website. But there are versions of it all over the internet. And you can read it. It's just a few pages long. And it tells you pretty much all you need to know for self-inquiry. But it's very concise. And each paragraph has got lots of gems in it. But it essentially says what you just said. You need to keep on doing it for as long as you need to. And he said self-inquiry is, because self-inquiry is something you initially do with the mind, but it takes you to no mind. And then when the mind comes back again, you're always questioning the ego. And then through looking at it, through looking for the ego, it's not there, but you still remain. And you're not the ego. So it's not a mental process saying, I'm not the ego. It's looking, and then there's nothing there, and then there's just this thoughtless reality. And if you stay there, it's not something, again, the words can be deceptive. It's not like you are staying there, because then if you are trying to stay there, then the self-inquiry goes, well, who's staying there? But in this text, Who Am I? Ramana Maharishi says that the who am I is like, it's a bit of a morbid metaphor he uses, but it's a one that would be very much understood by people in India. But he said the who am I self-inquiry is like at a funeral when they're burning the dead body on the funeral pyre. Who am I is like a stick they use to prod the body as it's burning to make sure all of it's burning. Yeah, because the body burning is representative of the ego. And then when the body's fully burnt, you throw the stick into the fire as well. The stick is the method, self-inquiry, who am I, which is a thought. And at the end, you throw away the inquiry as well. So the teaching destroys itself.
You must be changing your brain chemistry as well. Like the changing of the thought process must change the because it's literally an exercise for your brain changing the pathways. Does it seem that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because obviously what you also find in the spiritual circuit is I think I'm one of the few spiritual teachers who actually has a proper science background. You know, a lot of people are into sort of the scientific side of things, but they don't actually have much experience in science. Whereas I'm kind of the opposite. I actually have a science degree and a science background, but I don't sort of go into things like brain chemistry and stuff. Because I think it's a bit of a distraction. I mean, you might well be right. I'm not saying you're right or not right. I'm just saying it doesn't actually matter. I'm not saying it's not interesting either. But from the point of view of a seeker, it's experiential. And the brain chemistry side assumes a model of reality, that the brain is what's creating all thoughts and things like this. You see? So people start getting into this sort of materialistic model of reality, in which they're identified with the body and the brain, which is generating thoughts. And in a way, this is getting away from that. So we don't have to science it. We don't have to sort of science it. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason why I was kind of thinking about that is because kind of at the beginning level, I can see how some people would just become afraid. Like you do self-inquiry, you realize that your ego doesn't exist. That could, engender a lot of fear.
Yeah. One of the things about the traditional teachings is they recognize this. I didn't actually recognize this when I started teaching, because for me, I wasn't afraid of that. It just happened gradually, and I think it happened very slowly to me, gradually over time. So it wasn't a hard transition. And then when I had my peak experiences, like when I was a teenager, where the sense of self fell away, it was amazing. It felt great. So there wasn't this fear. But when I started sharing this with people, I noticed that some people got very afraid and very anxious. And that sort of changed the way I interacted and shared this. But you're absolutely right. It can be very scary. So the traditional teachings, what they do, they recognize this and they create a system in which the ego can deconstruct and destroy itself in the least destructive way, or as possible, or the way that creates as least suffering as possible. So it uses a series of constructs which are then sequentially deconstructed. So for example, it might say, I am pure consciousness. And I'm infinite pure consciousness. Now that makes, if you identify as pure consciousness, you're disidentifying from the body-mind. You're identifying as pure consciousness, which is much safer. It feels safe. But you're also at the same time detaching yourself from the identity of body-mind, limitation. You've now got a new attachment to this concept of consciousness. But it's safer than just suddenly going from ego to nothing, which is incredibly destabilizing. So these consciousness style teachings are really, really beautiful teachings. because they help us remain stable.
Kind of like the word embodiment. I mean, have you ever heard of the theory waking down instead of waking up?
No, I haven't. Oh, I think I might have done.
Wake, yeah, I think there was someone who was interviewed on Buddha at the gas pump, and I think the idea is like where you're allowing awakeness to come into the body rather than the idea. I know, like, if people talk about Kundalini, it's the idea that you're waking up, like the Kundalini rises. But
Hmm.
it seems like, from my experience, like when I've felt most like at one, it's like literally it enters into my idea of what I am, and so it's like it's the allowing in rather than the waking up. It feels,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I guess because waking up can be quite egoic in a way, can't it? It's like I'm waking up.
yeah, it's
I
like your
am the
egos can be becoming bigger.
Sorry, excuse me again. I've just got to get some water.
Yeah.
I think my voice might be giving out a bit on me. That's all. So I'll see how it goes.
We can just talk for another couple more minutes.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I think with the whole Kundalini thing, um, it can be interpreted like I'm becoming superhuman. I'm becoming Superman. So it's actually quite egoic. It's building up the me sense. I'm no longer little me. I'm now huge, powerful, big me. Whereas the other way you put it, when you're like just letting go and letting something come into you, you're actually effacing yourself. You're dissolving yourself. You're becoming less. You're diminishing yourself, which feels much more like it rather than, yes, I'm now a super Kundalini person. Because this isn't about being an amazing person, becoming like superhuman or super conscious. It's diminishing. It's like pure total humility.
You can see why most people aren't ready for that.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why we don't have to we don't have to teach people who don't want to be taught, because if you're not ready for it, you're not ready for it. You can, and people come to it in their own time. And God's got this. Doesn't need you or me. But it doesn't mean we don't do this.
To be honest, I just enjoy it. So, any last comments, Tom, that you would like to make, or?
Yeah, actually, I mean, silence is actually really important, I think, for many people. We've done a lot of talking today, and that's the nature of an interview, of course. but silence is very important. We can leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the conversation right here. Again, you can see Tom. I'll put a link to Tom's website down below, either in the comment section or in the description of the video, tomdoss.com. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thanks. Good to meet you. Good talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Bye.